Richard Bennett. For 15 years, Claire Bennett refused to say his name. Now it was the only name standing between her and death. As doctors waited for an answer that could save her life, Claire sat alone staring at a phone number she never thought she would dial again. On the other end of that number was a man she believed had abandoned his family. A man she blamed for 15 years of pain. A man she never expected to need. But before Claire could make the most important phone call of her life, she was about to discover that the story she had believed since she was 16 years old was missing one crucial piece. And that missing piece would change everything. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you watched part 1, type part 1 crew below so we know you're back for the conclusion. Now, let's uncover the truth behind Richard Bennett's disappearance. Out of millions of people, her father was the perfect match. The same man she had not spoken to in nearly 15 years. The same man she blamed for destroying her family. The same man she erased from nearly every chapter of her adult life. Suddenly, survival itself came attached to the one person she never imagined depending on again. Later that night, after Linda finally fell asleep inside the hospital recliner beside her bed, Claire sat awake staring at an old phone number written on a folded piece of paper given to her by the transplant coordinator. Her hands trembled so badly she almost dropped her phone twice before dialing. Part of her hoped the number no longer worked. Another part feared he might actually answer. The phone rang once. Then twice. Then a tired male voice finally answered softly. Hello. Claire froze completely. 15 years disappeared in an instant. Every memory came rushing back at once, the courthouse, the rain, the shouting, the unanswered questions, the birthdays, the silence. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Claire finally whispered one word. Dad. And Daniel Bennett's response was not what she expected at all. The moment Claire Bennett finally said the word, Dad, into the phone after 15 years of silence, Richard Bennett answered as though no time had passed at all. There was no anger in his voice. No bitterness. No hesitation. Just concern. Real concern. The kind that instantly unsettled Claire because it did not match the version of her father she had carried in her head for most of her adult life. Claire, are you okay? That was the first thing he asked her. Not why she disappeared. Not why she ignored him. Not why she suddenly called after 15 years. Only whether she was okay. Claire later admitted that hearing genuine fear in her father's voice confused her more than anything else. She had prepared herself for resentment, awkwardness, even rejection. But Richard sounded like a man who had been waiting years for the phone to ring. As doctors explained the transplant situation to him over speakerphone later that night, he agreed before they could even finish outlining the risks. I'll do whatever needs to be done, he said immediately. One of the nurses present during the call later described the moment as emotionally difficult to watch because Richard's answer came so fast it almost sounded rehearsed, like he had already decided years earlier that if Claire ever needed him, he would say yes without question. The following morning, Richard closed his repair shop in Indiana without explaining much to anyone. Security camera footage from a gas station along Interstate 70 later showed him driving through the night alone while heavy rain hit the windshield. In the passenger seat beside him sat an old cardboard box filled with photographs, folded papers, and several VHS tapes labeled in faded black marker. During one stop near the Ohio border, he reportedly sat inside the truck for nearly 30 minutes staring at a photograph of Claire as a child before continuing the drive toward Columbus. And somehow, the deeper Claire looked into her father's life during those days leading up to the transplant, the more uncomfortable her own memories became. Because almost nothing about Richard Bennett's behavior matched the monster she had spent years believing he was. While transplant coordinators handled medical evaluations, Claire remained inside the hospital recovering from another exhausting dialysis treatment when Mark arrived carrying several storage boxes taken from Linda's attic. Linda initially resisted bringing them, insisting there was no reason to reopen painful memories now. But Claire had become obsessed with understanding why Richard never defended himself during the divorce. The question had started consuming her late at night while lying awake beside hospital machines. If her father truly abandoned the family voluntarily, why had he carried so much visible guilt afterward? Why continue reaching out for years after being rejected repeatedly? Why agree to risk his own health for her without hesitation now? The answers, it turned out, had been buried inside forgotten boxes for years. Claire spent hours going through old financial records, family documents, photographs, and home videos while rain tapped softly against the hospital window outside. Some discoveries seemed small at first but slowly formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Bank records showed Richard continued paying portions of Claire's tuition and insurance years after the divorce despite barely speaking to her. Old voicemail recordings revealed messages that sounded heartbroken rather than defensive. In one tape recorded shortly after Claire's 18th birthday, Richard's voice cracked while apologizing for everything she would someday understand. That sentence haunted Claire immediately. Everything she would someday understand. Then came the first major inconsistency in Linda's story. Claire found no evidence anywhere that Richard had another woman. No hidden accounts. No suspicious travel records. No secret apartment. Nothing. In fact, financial records painted the opposite picture entirely. Richard's personal savings had almost completely disappeared during the years leading up to the divorce, mostly spent on medical consultations, neurological specialists, and treatments Claire had never heard about before. Neurological specialists. Claire's stomach tightened instantly. Hours later, while searching deeper through old folders, she uncovered a sealed envelope dated nearly 16 years earlier, only months before the divorce. Inside were medical reports from a private clinic in Chicago diagnosing Richard Bennett with a progressive degenerative neurological condition. Several pages described worsening symptoms, memory lapses, muscle weakness, and long-term cognitive decline. One physician's note specifically mentioned concerns about Richard eventually requiring assisted care if the illness advanced aggressively. Claire stared at the documents for several minutes without breathing properly. Suddenly, memories she had ignored for years came rushing back. Richard forgetting appointments. The exhaustion. The mysterious phone calls. The hidden paperwork she once saw him shove into a kitchen drawer. None of it involved another woman. Her father had been sick. Very sick. And he had hidden it from her. What Claire discovered next shattered her even further. Buried inside another folder was an old recorded conversation between Richard and Linda captured accidentally on a camcorder years earlier. The video itself only showed a dark living room because someone had forgotten to stop recording after a family gathering. But their voices were unmistakable. "I don't want her watching me fall apart," Richard said quietly. Linda sounded exhausted. Crying softly. "She deserves a normal life, Richard. I'd rather she hate me than spend her childhood afraid." Claire stopped the recording immediately, unable to process what she had just heard. The divorce had not started because Richard abandoned his family. It started because he believed his illness would destroy their lives. And Linda knew the truth the entire time. In the beginning, Linda apparently agreed with Richard's decision to keep the diagnosis hidden from Claire. Medical records showed doctors were uncertain how quickly the disease would progress, and Richard became convinced distancing himself from the family would protect his daughter emotionally. According to later notes from counseling sessions Claire eventually uncovered, Richard feared Claire would spend her teenage years watching him slowly deteriorate physically and mentally. He believed leaving was an act of sacrifice. But somewhere over the years, grief transformed into resentment. Linda stopped correcting Claire's hatred. Then eventually began feeding it. And Richard accepted the blame silently all those years because exposing the truth would reveal the illness Claire was never supposed to carry emotionally. That realization broke something inside her. For nearly 15 years, Claire punished a man who had destroyed himself trying to protect her. Yet the deepest emotional blow came later that night. One of the storage boxes contained dozens of sealed envelopes organized carefully by year. Claire recognized her father's handwriting immediately. Her hands trembled as she opened the first letter dated on her 17th birthday. Inside, Richard described how badly he wanted to call her but feared hearing hatred in her voice. Another letter written after her college graduation explained how proud he felt watching her from the back of the crowd without her knowing he was there. One envelope contained a wedding gift receipt along with a handwritten apology for missing the most important day of her life, even though Claire now realized he had actually driven there hoping just to see her smile from a distance. Every year, Richard wrote to her. Birthdays. Christmases. Graduations. Her engagement. The birth of her son. Dozens and dozens of letters. None ever mailed. Claire sat alone inside the dim hospital room reading them through tears while machines beeped quietly around her. For the first time since she was 16 years old, the image she carried of her father completely collapsed. But even after discovering all of this, there was still one final secret nobody had told her yet. The deeper doctors examined Richard Bennett's condition before the transplant, the more tense the atmosphere inside the hospital became. At first, Claire assumed the additional testing was routine. Every donor went through extensive evaluations, and she tried convincing herself the whispered conversations between specialists meant nothing serious. But over the next several days, something changed. Nurses stopped speaking openly whenever she entered the hallway. Transplant coordinators suddenly delayed surgery meetings without clear explanations. Once, Claire noticed two neurologists reviewing Richard's brain scans while arguing quietly near a conference room door before immediately lowering their voices when they saw her approaching. She knew then that something was wrong. What Claire did not know was just how serious the situation had become. Richard Bennett's illness had progressed far beyond what doctors initially expected. Years earlier, specialists believed his neurological condition would worsen gradually over decades. Instead, new scans revealed accelerating degeneration affecting not only his nervous system but other critical bodily functions as well. The stress of major surgery combined with living on one kidney afterward could significantly shorten his remaining lifespan. One surgeon privately described the operation as medically dangerous for a man already physically weakened by years of illness. Another physician argued the hospital should reconsider approving the transplant altogether. Claire overheard part of that conversation by accident. She had stepped out of her room late one evening unable to sleep when she heard her father's name mentioned from inside a nearby consultation office. The door was slightly open. Through the gap, she heard phrases she would never forget. His body may not recover. The surgery could accelerate everything. If complications happen, he may not survive long-term. Claire felt the blood drain from her face instantly. For several seconds, she stood frozen outside the doorway while doctors continued discussing probabilities and surgical risks like numbers on a chart instead of a human life. Then someone quietly closed the door before noticing she had heard enough already. That night, Claire sat alone inside her dark hospital room staring at the city lights outside the window while every memory of her father replayed differently in her mind. The camping trips. The birthday cards. The silence after the divorce. The letters he never mailed. Suddenly none of it looked like abandonment anymore. It looked like sacrifice. Painful, devastating sacrifice carried by a man who believed disappearing from his daughter's life would somehow protect her from future suffering. And now, after losing 15 years with her, he was preparing to risk what remained of his life to save hers. Claire finally broke emotionally the following morning. She found Richard sitting alone inside a quiet hospital waiting area reviewing paperwork with tired hands. He looked older than she remembered now that she allowed herself to truly see him again. The gray hair. The trembling fingers. The exhaustion beneath his eyes. For years she imagined her father living happily somewhere far away without caring whether she existed. Instead, she found a lonely, physically weakened man carrying decades of guilt and silence. When Richard looked up and saw tears in Claire's eyes, he immediately understood. "You heard them," he said softly. Claire could barely speak through the emotion building in her chest. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" she whispered. Richard stared down at the papers for several seconds before answering. "Because I'd rather have you hate me than watch me die." The room went completely silent after that. Claire later described that moment as the exact second her entire understanding of her father collapsed permanently. 15 years of resentment suddenly collided with the horrifying realization that the men she blamed for ruining her life had actually spent those same years trying to protect her from pain. Richard explained that when doctors first diagnosed him, he became terrified of what Claire's future might look like watching him slowly deteriorate. He remembered seeing his own father suffer through illness as a child and could not bear the thought of Claire experiencing the same fear. Linda initially agreed they should keep the diagnosis hidden while Claire was young. But once the divorce happened, everything spiraled emotionally beyond either of their control. "I thought eventually you'd move on and forget me," Richard admitted quietly. Instead, she spent 15 years hating him. And he allowed it. Because correcting the lie would mean revealing the illness he desperately wanted hidden from her. Claire collapsed into tears beside him, apologizing repeatedly through broken breaths while Richard held her hand for the first time since she was 16 years old. Nurses passing nearby later said neither of them noticed people staring. Years of grief, misunderstanding, guilt, and silence finally exploded all at once inside that small waiting room. But the emotional devastation was far from over. Later that afternoon, the transplant board formally warned Richard against proceeding with surgery. Doctors outlined every possible complication carefully. There was increased risk of accelerated neurological decline. Higher chances of surgical stress damaging already weakened systems. Possibility of shortened lifespan. They explained repeatedly that another donor might eventually become available if they waited longer. Richard refused immediately. "There isn't time," he said calmly. Claire begged him to reconsider after hearing the risks directly from surgeons herself. For the first time since reconnecting with her father, she became terrified of losing him all over again. The guilt alone felt unbearable. How could she allow a man she spent years rejecting to sacrifice the remainder of his health for her survival? But Richard never changed his mind. One nurse later recalled watching him sign the surgical consent papers completely alone while sitting beneath dim hospital lighting late at night. No dramatic speeches. No hesitation. Just a quiet signature from a father who had already decided long ago that his daughter's life mattered more than his own. The morning of the surgery arrived with unbearable tension hanging across the entire hospital floor. Claire lay trembling inside pre-operation holding while nurses prepared 4 lines around her. Down another hallway, Richard sat silently in a hospital gown staring at an old photograph of Claire as a child riding on his shoulders during a family vacation near Lake Erie. Witnesses later said he looked strangely peaceful despite everything. As operating room teams prepared both surgeries simultaneously, Claire finally asked to see her father one last time before anesthesia. When Richard entered the room, neither of them spoke at first. There was too much history between them now. Too much regret. Too many lost years neither could ever recover. Claire reached for his hand weakly. "I wasted so much time hating you," she whispered. Richard shook his head immediately. "No," he said softly. "You were protecting your mother. You were just a kid." Claire started crying harder. For 15 years, this man carried blame that was never entirely his, and still refused to make her feel guilty for it. Minutes later, nurses separated them as surgical teams rolled both beds toward operating rooms beneath harsh white lights. The hallway felt impossibly quiet except for wheels moving across polished floors and distant monitor beeping echoing through corridors. Claire kept looking toward her father until they disappeared in opposite directions. Then came the waiting. Hours passed. Mark sat beside Linda in complete silence while surgeons worked behind closed doors. Every update took too long. Every passing minute increased the fear something had gone wrong. At one point, alarms sounded briefly somewhere down the surgical wing before suddenly stopping again. Nurses rushed past without explanation. Linda buried her face into her hands, sobbing quietly while Mark paced near the waiting room windows, unable to sit still. Inside the operating rooms, doctors fought through complications no one had fully anticipated. And then suddenly, a flatline sound echoed sharply through the hallway monitor system. Everything went black. For several terrifying seconds after the flatline echoed through the surgical wing, nobody inside the waiting room moved. Linda Bennett later said the silence that followed felt worse than screaming because every person sitting there immediately feared the exact same thing. Mark stood frozen beside the window while nurses rushed past the hallway without making eye contact. Somewhere behind those operating room doors, 2 lives hung in the balance. A daughter who spent 15 years hating her father and a man willing to risk what remained of his own future just to save her anyway. Then finally, nearly 6 hours after the surgeries began, one of the surgeons pushed through the waiting room doors still wearing his surgical cap. Both survived. Linda collapsed into tears almost immediately. Claire's transplant had been successful. Her body was responding well to the donor kidney, and doctors believed the surgery likely saved her life. But Richard Bennett's condition worried them deeply. Complications during surgery combined with the strain placed on his already weakened body left him significantly more fragile than before. Recovery would be difficult. Specialists warned the neurological progression they feared might now accelerate faster. Still, he survived. When Claire finally regained consciousness hours later inside the recovery room, the first thing she noticed was the overwhelming quiet. Machines beeped softly around her while sunlight from the early morning sky filtered faintly through hospital blinds. For a moment, she struggled remembering where she was. Then the memories returned all at once, the surgery, the letters, the diagnosis, the years lost between her and her father. Her first question was barely audible. "Is he alive?" A nurse smiled gently before nodding. Claire started crying immediately. Later that evening, after doctors stabilized Richard enough to move him into recovery, Claire insisted on seeing him despite still barely being able to sit upright herself. Nurses wheeled her slowly down the hallway toward his room while her hands shook uncontrollably the entire way. She had spent 15 years preparing herself emotionally for a future without her father. Now suddenly, after almost losing him forever, she realized how desperately she wanted more time. Richard looked exhausted when she entered the room. Weaker. Paler. The surgery had clearly taken a heavy toll on him already. But the moment he saw Claire sitting there alive, something in his expression softened in a way words could never fully describe. For the first time since Claire was 16 years old, father and daughter simply sat together in silence holding each other's hands. No anger. No accusations. No walls left between them. Only grief for the years both of them lost. It was during those quiet recovery days that Linda Bennett finally admitted the full truth about what happened after Richard's diagnosis all those years earlier. Sitting beside Claire's hospital bed one evening, Linda broke down emotionally in a way her daughter had never witnessed before. Years of bitterness, guilt, and unresolved resentment finally surfaced at once. "I thought I was protecting you," Linda whispered through tears. At first, she truly believed separating Claire from Richard's illness was the right decision. Watching doctors explain the possibility of long-term degeneration terrified both of them. Richard became convinced leaving would spare Claire years of emotional trauma, and Linda supported that choice initially because she feared watching him deteriorate too. But after the divorce, pain slowly transformed into anger. Linda admitted she struggled watching Richard leave while she stayed behind carrying the emotional weight of raising Claire alone. Every difficult moment afterward deepened her resentment further. And eventually, she stopped correcting Claire's hatred. Then later, she quietly encouraged it. Not because she wanted Claire destroyed emotionally, but because anger became easier to live with than grief. Linda convinced herself Richard deserved the blame for leaving even if the original reasons were more complicated than Claire ever knew. Over time, the lie hardened into reality inside the family until nobody remembered how far things had drifted from the truth. Claire listened silently while tears rolled down her face. One decision. One secret. One moment outside a courthouse in the rain. And nearly 15 years of love disappeared because nobody found the courage to tell the truth. But the final heartbreak came days later during one quiet conversation between Claire and Richard inside his recovery room. Richard asked Mark to retrieve an old box from his apartment in Indiana. Inside were photographs Claire had never seen before. Hundreds of them. Some blurry. Some taken from far away. Others hidden carefully inside envelopes labeled by year. Claire stared at them in disbelief. There was a photograph of her college graduation taken from high in the back row of the auditorium. Another from outside her wedding reception showing Claire dancing through a window while Richard stood alone near the parking lot. One image captured Mark carrying their newborn son out of the hospital years earlier while an older man stood partially hidden across the street beside a parked truck. Richard had been there. For everything. Every major moment of her life. Always from a distance. Always unseen. Claire broke down completely while flipping through the photographs because suddenly she realized her father never truly abandoned her at all. Even after years of silence, rejection, and hatred, he kept showing up quietly wherever life allowed him to. Not to interrupt. Not to force forgiveness. Just to see his daughter happy from afar. That realization stayed with Claire long after the hospital days ended. In the months following the transplant, Claire visited Richard constantly while he continued struggling through difficult recovery and worsening neurological symptoms. The future remained uncertain for both of them in different ways. There was no magical ending capable of restoring the 15 years they lost. No apology large enough to erase the damage caused by silence, fear, and misplaced resentment. But there was finally truth. And sometimes, truth arrives too late to prevent pain, but just in time to heal something else. Because in the end, Claire Bennett discovered something heartbreaking about family, forgiveness, and the people we think hurt us most. Sometimes the people we resent the deepest are the same people who loved us the most quietly. And sometimes, forgiveness only arrives after years we can never get back. As the weeks passed after the transplant, life inside the Bennett family slowly began changing in ways none of them thought were still possible. Claire started bringing her young son to visit Richard every weekend, allowing a grandfather and grandson who should have known each other years earlier to finally build memories together. Some days were emotionally difficult. Richard's health remained fragile, and there were moments when Claire caught herself grieving not only the possibility of losing him someday, but also grieving the 15 years they never had. Simple conversations often carried enormous emotional weight now. A shared coffee. A quiet drive. Watching old home videos together. Every small moment suddenly mattered because both father and daughter understood time differently after almost losing each other forever. But even after the truth surfaced, one painful question remained impossible to answer completely. Who was really responsible for destroying this family? Was it Richard Bennett for believing abandonment would somehow protect his daughter from pain? Was it Linda Bennett for allowing bitterness to slowly poison Claire's understanding of her father? Or was it simply fear itself that ruined everything? Because fear has a way of convincing people they are protecting the ones they love while quietly breaking them apart instead. And perhaps the hardest part of this entire story is realizing that nobody inside this family believed they were acting out of cruelty. Richard thought sacrifice meant disappearing. Linda thought survival meant turning grief into anger. Claire thought loyalty meant standing beside her mother no matter what. Yet all three spent years emotionally trapped inside a misunderstanding that stole precious time none of them could ever recover again. That is what makes stories like this so painful. Not evil. Not hatred. But silence. The kind of silence that grows slowly between people until eventually nobody remembers how to cross the distance anymore. And somewhere tonight, there are families living through similar pain right now. Parents and children no longer speaking. Divorces that turned into permanent emotional wars. Years disappearing because pride became stronger than communication. Relationships destroyed not by one terrible moment, but by thousands of quiet ones left unresolved. So after hearing Claire and Richard Bennett's story, we want to ask you something honestly. Could you forgive someone after losing 15 years? If you were in Claire's position, would you have accepted the kidney? And after everything you've heard, who do you think caused the deepest damage inside this family? Leave your thoughts in the comments below because stories like this often reveal how differently people see forgiveness, sacrifice, and family loyalty. And if you enjoy emotional real-life documentaries filled with shocking twists, hidden truths, and unforgettable human stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary. Because tomorrow, we uncover the unbelievable true story of a man who attended his own funeral. And nobody recognized him.